Economists have for years been arguing that China needs to rebalance its economy toward consumption. Well, reading between the lines, you might think it's finally happening. That's because Chinese officials have been saying stuff like this from China's premier back in February. Beijing is pretty clearly saying it wants to boost growth with household spending, and that's broadly been interpreted as meaning that rebalancing is actually happening this time. Spoiler alert, it's not, and it's not about to either. Rebalancing is about putting consumption at the center of the Chinese economy, like it is with most countries. China's problem is that the Chinese public spend far less relative to the size of their economy than almost any other people on Earth. Rebalancing isn't just about convincing them to save a little bit less and spend a little bit more, which is kind of what Beijing's been doing with its recent policies. Rather, rebalancing is about permanently increasing the capacity of people to spend, either because their expenses have come down or their income has gone up. Doing either of those things requires wealth redistribution. And while there's a bunch of ways to do that, most Chinese economists agree, especially the ones advising the government, that the only way to do it relatively quickly, on a scale that really moves the needle, is by expanding the welfare system. But that isn't likely to happen. And it isn't because of Xi Jinping, who is often assumed to be the roadblock because of his well-documented aversion to welfarism. But that doesn't really gel with the speeches he's given about wanting to spend more on healthcare and pensions. Rather, the sticking point is that the party has a deep-rooted fear of what it sometimes refers to as Latin Americanization, in which it sees a nexus between spending too much too soon on welfare and economic stagnation. Now, I'll come back to all that in a bit, but what I want to do here is break down this whole consumption conundrum China is dealing with. Why a consumption-led economy depends on better welfare. Why the party is so focused on avoiding the experiences of Latin America. And why consumption-led growth is the endpoint of the economic transformation Beijing is trying to engineer, not the starting point. China's economy is currently going through a radical transformation, but it's not immediately clear, particularly to outsiders, what it's trying to achieve. We tend to make assumptions based on what we think China should be doing, or based on how we think economies should operate. But China does things differently. The system works differently. The logic of the political class is different. Our starting point should be understanding what they're trying to achieve on their own terms. And that's how we need to approach consumption and rebalancing. Now, it's important to recognize that there are two very different consumption-related issues here that often get conflated. First, there's the short-term problem, which is that household spending has been weak since the pandemic. Beijing has rolled out a bunch of policies to get people spending again, mostly subsidies for appliances and home electronics, and that's really why consumption's been getting so much attention, because of these short-term stimulus measures. Then there's the bigger, longer-term issue, and that's China needs a new growth model, and that's where this idea of rebalancing comes in. In most economies, most economic activity is driven by consumption. That's people spending money on food and Netflix and haircuts and whatever. The rest is mostly made up of investment, and there's a smaller bit from exports. In most countries, household consumption makes up around 60% of GDP. In China, it's just 39%. Out of 146 countries, China ranks 10th from the bottom. Even countries with similar income levels, like Turkey and Malaysia, consume far more than China does. Beijing has deliberately kept it so low for the past couple of decades because that's been its path to growth. That growth has been driven by investment, specifically the construction of housing and infrastructure and the factories needed to support all of that construction. And that made sense. China was catching up. Japan and South Korea did the same thing back in the day. Where China differs is that its economy has remained lopsided far longer than any other, and consumption far lower. And now that growth model no longer works. The population is shrinking, and the country will never again need to build as much housing as it used to. Local governments are so overstretched financially that it's not feasible for them to keep funding public works programs like before. So if investment-led growth isn't sustainable anymore, that means the economy needs to lean more on exports and consumption. Of those two, exports shouldn't really be an option. Export-led growth works for small economies, but for an economy as big as China, you need to export a lot to generate even a little bit of GDP growth. And in this global environment where trade balances have become so sensitive, relying on exports to deliver growth is a bit iffy. So that leaves domestic consumption. Some economists argue that the proper response to these imbalances is for China just to accept permanently lower rates of growth, say 2% annually. You just let investment decline naturally, you stop pushing exports, and consumption will naturally become the driver of growth, albeit at much lower levels. That may be the case, but it is most definitely not part of the conversation in Beijing. In China, the debate about rebalancing is not about finding a natural equilibrium. It's about unlocking people's potential to spend. Which brings us back to this question of why aren't Chinese households spending more? The usual explanation is that it's cultural. People say Chinese families are just naturally thrifty. And sure, that might play a part, but they're also saving because the welfare system is chronically underfunded, and people need to take responsibility for ensuring their retirement is adequately funded, and for covering potentially onerous healthcare costs. But the bigger issue isn't that they're saving so much, but rather they're enjoying so little of the nation's wealth. That can be difficult to get your head around because the quality of life of most Chinese people has improved dramatically over the past few decades. But that's because China's economic pie has been getting bigger. Their share of the pie has remained small. Instead, a disproportionately large amount of the national wealth accrues to firms, which is by design because that's how you enable an investment-led economy. You make sure firms have lots of cheap capital that they can keep reinvesting. So rather than the wealth being distributed to ordinary people as wages and bonuses or dividends, or even as welfare via the tax system, it stays in corporate China. That's the reason behind China's massive trade surplus. China exports so much and imports so little because the public can't afford to purchase everything the economy produces. But if the public received a greater share of the wealth, trade wouldn't be so imbalanced. I'll get into the mechanics of how all of this works some other time, but suffice to say that by international standards, Chinese people are getting shortchanged by their own economic model. Now, that's not to say they haven't done well, it's just that they should have done better, especially the hundreds of millions of people who've been left behind. Liu Shijin, a longtime government economist, put it like this: China still has 500 million people who have not used seated toilets and 1 billion people who've never taken a plane. If we tap part or most of that demand, we can release huge growth potential. So, how do you tap that potential? Either people need to feel secure enough to save less, or they need to earn more. Either way, it means redistributing wealth in some way. And there's a bunch of ways you could do that. You can cut interest rates on existing mortgages, thereby affecting a mass transfer of wealth from banks to homeowners. Or you could force companies to pay dividends, or even better, multiple dividends each year as a way of transferring wealth from publicly traded companies to shareholders. Or you could reduce costs for people by forcing state-owned firms to stop abusing their market power. For example, you could allow people to keep their phone number when they change service providers, so that telecoms companies can no longer have a captive market that can overcharge. The thing is, Beijing has already done all these things, and yet none of it has had a discernible impact on consumption, which is why most Chinese economists end up in the same place. If you want to seriously boost consumption, you've got to expand welfare. And the one change that gets the most support is equal treatment for migrant workers. Right now, China's 300 million internal migrants, people who've moved from the countryside to the cities, don't get full access to public services in places where they live. It's a two-tiered system. Full benefits for official urban residents and second-class status for migrants. Fix that, and you give a huge group of people more security, which means they can start spending more and saving less. And Beijing is on board with it. It's actually policy. It's just that the powers that be haven't put up the money to do it, and they're not likely to. The belief that it's Xi himself who was personally standing in the way of expanding welfare goes back to a speech he gave in 2021 when he said, "We must not adopt the welfarism approach, supporting a group of lazy people who got something for nothing." Fair enough, but it's actually the rest of his comments that get to the heart of his concerns about welfare. And this is where Latin Americanization comes in, which is also sometimes called welfare catch-up. Xi's critique is that Latin American countries, naming no names, tried to build Western-style welfare systems before they were able to generate the tax revenue to pay for it. So instead of paying for it with taxes, they funded it with debt. The debt piled up, their economy stagnated, and they got trapped, never able to grow beyond being just developing economies. Xi didn't come up with these ideas. It appears in party publications and academic writing going back at least a decade. But Xi explains it this way: welfare benefits cannot be reduced once they have gone up. It is unsustainable to engage in welfarism that exceeds one's ability, as it will inevitably bring about serious economic and political problems. We must persist in acting within our means. That phrase, within our means, comes up a lot in official documents. In short, it means they want to spend more on welfare, but they don't want to borrow to do it. That might seem a little odd given that the Chinese state clearly has no problem with debt. Local governments have borrowed obscene amounts for public works. But the difference is that infrastructure is considered an investment, something that, at least in theory, pays off with future growth. Welfare, on the other hand, is an expense. You pay it out this year, and again next year, and the year after that, and there's no direct return. At the moment, the government's finances are maxed out, which is why, even though it wants to spend more on social programs, it's holding back. That said, there will be some exceptions. Last year, Xi Jinping branded China's falling birth rate as a national security issue, which seemingly opens the door to more spending on things like childcare, even if the taxes aren't there to cover it. But overall, Beijing worries that funding welfare with debt sets it on the road to Latin Americanization, where once vibrant economies got stuck because they were spending beyond their means. And that brings us to the real issue, which is China's tax base is just too small. In 2023, China's tax to GDP ratio, the amount of tax it collects relative to the size of the economy, was about 20%. The OECD average was 34%. Now, that's the gap between what China wants to do and what it can afford. Rich countries can sustain bigger welfare systems because their people earn more and can pay more in taxes without being any worse off, like South Korea. In the decade from 2021, its per capita income rose by 20%. And over that time, its tax to GDP ratio rose by 6 percentage points, from 23 to 29%. If China could do the same, it'd bring in an extra 6 to 7 trillion renminbi a year. That's enough to seriously expand social spending. But China's not there yet. The economy needs to grow more, and households need to earn more before that kind of tax base becomes possible. I think one of the reasons there's such a fixation on China need to pivot to consumption-led growth is because economists don't see an option. Investment is out, exports are out, and so that leaves consumption almost by default. But Beijing doesn't see it this way. I said earlier that China needs a new growth model. The thing is, it already has one. Beijing has decided that innovation, industrial upgrading, and exports are the new model. And if it works, it will eventually mean higher corporate profits, higher incomes, higher taxes, and more government capacity to fund welfare. Of course, there are plenty of things that can go wrong with this new model, and we'll get into that some other time. But for the time being, it's enough to say that yes, Beijing wants far more consumption. And it might even want a consumption-led economy. But all that comes at the end of this economic transformation, when China can afford it, not at the beginning. In short, China is not rebalancing. So what is it doing? Well, we'll get into that in another video.